All right, everyone saw the dramatic footage of the Boeing E-3, the American Sentry, an airborne early warning platform that was destroyed at Prince Sultan Air Base over in Saudi Arabia last weekend. That aircraft was destroyed by an Iranian drone or missile attack. It's not clear. Up to now, at least, I haven't seen if either side has admitted whether the weapon was a missile or a drone. But the attack was so precise, right against the HADAM on the rear fuselage of the plane, that this probably indicates the provision of highly precise intelligence. Meanwhile, many people are speculating that Russia provided the necessary intelligence, those positions, those coordinates needed for the Iranians to hit this plane directly. Just like, for example, a Russian early warning plane was hit last year by a Ukrainian drone attack at a base far from Ukraine over there in Russia. Remember that? There was even a short video of the drone landing on the HADAM. But, all right, let's understand what kind of plane this is, what its importance is in the context of the current war, and for future operations that we might see in the coming weeks. Okay, so let's first understand the basic concept of what kind of plane this is. This is an airborne early warning and control aircraft. It's an acronym you might have seen a lot. AEW&C, Airborne Early Warning and Control. This means the following: Airborne Early Warning and Control. Or you might have seen another acronym, which is AWACS, AWACS, which we usually use for the same purpose. But however, it's an acronym that designates a specific aircraft from the American arsenal, which is this one, the Sentry, that was destroyed last weekend, right? This acronym, AWACS, stands for Airborne Warning and Control System. That is Air Alert and Control System. This acronym, the second one, AWACS, I prefer it because I think it's clearer, right? It makes it clearer what the purpose of this aircraft is, and it has two purposes, right? As you saw there, Air Alert. It gives a warning about enemy activity through the air. It's an air alert. And it's also a control center because this aircraft controls the actions, or at least it indicates, right? The actions, possibilities for action by other units of its own forces, whether air units, ground units, naval units, or missile units, right? So this system, which today is a very well-developed system, was actually created back in the famous Second World War. Still, right? And we can trace the origin of this system back to the very beginning of the war, or the late 1930s in England, when England implemented the chain home or national radar chain, positioned there in the southeast of England, facing the European continent, to be able to detect waves of enemy aircraft that would come to attack targets in England. This chain home was a creation, of several very important engineers and scientists there in England. But its implementation can be traced to Air Marshal Hugh Dowden. After building this whole chain of radars, he managed to get the greatest possible benefit from it during the Battle of Britain, right? Because the English were able to detect all the German bomber formations coming to attack England very early. And that gave the English the ability to survive the German attacks even under heavy assault and with reduced numbers, right? But then, man, here's what happens. Every new technology opens doors, right? Many doors. And when we talk about radar, we're not talking about a technology exclusive to England, because the Germans also had radar. At that time, other countries around the world were also experimenting with their first radar prototypes. But the English, they had a peculiarity. They had a real trump card in their hands. Really, a little treasure they created there at the end of the 1930s called the cavity magnetron, if you're reading English language sources, right? This little device, man, was revolutionary because it generated such a high wave frequency, so high that it could detect objects in the air with much greater accuracy than the enemy's radars, right? So the clarity of the English radar readings, which they ended up sharing with the Americans in 1940, right, was very, very important for the development of electronic warfare in the following years. And then some impressive things are going to happen, right? Because the development based on the cavity magnetron allowed by the end of 1940 for an airborne radar set, that is, one installed on an aircraft, to be created. Because a very urgent need for this appeared, the Germans, having lost the Normandy coast to the Allies in the previous months, right, starting from the summer of 44, were left without bases to launch V-1 flying bombs. So an emergency method was developed to launch V-1 bombs from Heinkel, He-111 bombers. They were mounted there under the wing of the Heinkel and were launched over the North Sea against their targets in England. These bombs, which started to be launched from the Heinkels, began to worry the English a lot, and therefore they developed this solution. What you're seeing there is a Vickers Wellington 14 equipped with a rotating radar antenna on top of the rear fuselage. You can see it. Just imagine that working, with the antenna spinning back there. It would sweep the horizon because it could really only look at the horizon, right? It would sweep the horizon, searching for aircraft flying in that area. So you combine this with the ground stations, which were often located far from the North Sea, because that's where the Germans flew and dropped the bombs, right? That plane there, the Vickers Wellington, could fly over the sea, staying much closer to potential enemy bombers, and it could send out an alert. Look, there's an unknown plane here, so keep an eye on it and send interceptors over here. So this Vickers Wellington provided early airborne warning. It would notify the Bristol Bullfighter fighters to intercept those enemy bombers, right? Those German Heinkel bombers, got it? And then the Americans in the Pacific faced a slightly different problem and came up with a similar solution over there in the Pacific. The kamikaze attacks, which started appearing from the end of 1944 also, right there in the Philippines region, the kamikaze attacks started to really worry the Americans. And one of the aspects that really worried them was that the American radars, the radar stations, were being set up at that time on the destroyers, right? On the smaller ships, which were set up as if they were a big early warning chain, right? And they would keep circling there to detect those planes that could come and attack. The thing is, the destroyer was exactly the target of the kamikaze. So you're setting up the radar on a warship, on a ship, on a platform. That is exactly the target of your enemy. So you could go blind at any moment, you know? So the Americans thought, damn, it would be better if we could put a radar on a plane, right? A plane is smaller, it'll be flying around, and it's not a target for the kamikazes. That's where the idea came from to create what you're seeing here, a TBM, right? A Grumman TBM Avenger bomber called the TBM-3W, which got that big radome on its belly, see, for a new radar. And this aircraft was supposed to fly around, right, circling along a route to protect the American fleet in order to detect kamikazes or any other wave of enemy air attacks. So they could give the warning as quickly as possible so the destroyers themselves could protect themselves. You see, this plane entered service in March of 45, right at the very end of the war, and it sets the stage for post-war developments. Right, in 1949, only in 1949, the Americans decided to create a plane that was 100% dedicated to airborne early warning. And this plane would be based on the Lockheed Constellation platform, that 4-engine transport plane. One of the most beautiful things that aviation has ever produced to this day, in my opinion, the Lockheed Constellation. So the Constellation platform became in 1949 the Lockheed EC-121 Warning Star. Or Warning Star, right? Star of, early warning, warning, alert, alert, star. So the Warning Star. It also carried a radar on its back. And it was adopted by both the United States Air Force and the United States Navy, operating for 3 decades. Man, this plane operated for a really long time, okay? Given the quality of the platform, the electronics, everything, it operated until 1982, just so you know. And the Soviets took a little longer to mature their own technology, their radar electronics. And only in 1965 did they put the Tupolev Tu-126 into operation, which was their first early warning aircraft. Truly dedicated based on the Tupolev 114 transport aircraft platform. The actual airliner Tupolev 114 4 engines as well. The aircraft was wonderful. I think these planes are beautiful, right? Those planes that have the profile similar to the Constellation and others, right? So what's going to happen, guys? In 1963, the Air Force already started looking for a replacement for the Warning Star, right? Because they already wanted to use a jet platform there and also add the new radar technologies. Already from the 60s, which far surpassed those technologies from the late 40s that were on the Warning Star, right? What technologies were those? The first one, the most important one, is look-down capability, the ability to detect targets below the aircraft. That is, the radar can not only scan the horizon, but also look down. The radar can look down. So Westinghouse implemented this new radar of theirs in the form of a radome, a circle. It would actually keep spinning. It would keep spinning on top of the aircraft, mounted there on the rear fuselage, and that disc would keep spinning all the time. Even today, we can still see that. Of course, they're still in operation. And the difference is that this plane is based on the Boeing 707 platform. Right, because in 1970, the Boeing 707 was chosen for this platform. Since it was already a fully tested aircraft, it was much more worthwhile to adapt it than to create a new plane. So what happened? The plane flew much higher, much faster, and it scanned not just the horizon, but also down below. It's like a kind of umbrella, just imagine it like that. So this plane got authorization to have its prototype built in 1973. And then in 1975, it flew for the first time, right? The first operational tests started to be carried out. And then this first E-3 Sentry began flying all over the globe. In the Americas, in the Middle East, in Asia, everywhere, it was tested, and the results were very, very, very promising. So in 1977, the first Boeing E-3 Sentry came off the assembly line dedicated to the United States Air Force, right? Here's a fun fact you're going to love, man. In 1977, do you know who else bought a Boeing E-3 Sentry? Iran? The Shah of Iran bought no less than 10 Boeing E-3 Sentry aircraft for the Imperial Iranian Air Force in 1977. Of course, those 10 units were never delivered, right? After the revolution in January 1979, they were canceled. All foreign contracts were canceled with Iran, so they never arrived. Those 10 Boeings never made it to the arsenal of the Iranian Air Force. Very well, very well, very well. The Boeing E-3 Sentry was in production from 1977 until 1992. In total, 68 units were manufactured, not only for the U.S. Air Force, but also for the British Air Force, for Saudi Arabia, for France, and for the NATO Air Command, which is based in Belgium, and Luxembourg too. And also when the British retired, they retired their Sentry. Then, a few years ago, Chile ended up buying one of these planes, right? So the Chilean Air Force is today, here in South America, the only one that operates a Sentry. Okay, so guys, what's going to happen? In 2012, Boeing developed an alternative, a successor to the E-3 Sentry, which they called the Boeing E-7 Wedgetail. Okay? The Wedgetail's radar technology isn't that spinning disc technology. It's basically a kind of bar, right, that stays there, look, mounted on the rear fuselage of the aircraft. This aircraft is an export model from Boeing. It's already been sold to the RAF, right, the British Air Force, but also to the Turkish Air Force, the South Korean Air Force, and also the Australian Air Force. And although Boeing has been trying to sell this to the United States Air Force, so far they haven't actually managed to make that sale. Okay? Why? Because since that time, 2012, the United States was already planning to retire its Sentry aircraft, its E-3 Sentry aircraft, and replace them with space-based platforms. In other words, just use satellites there for detection and also for control. Okay? The AWACS role would be handled by satellites. I don't know to what extent that choice was logical, or if today it has already run into technological barriers. You know, that is, technological limitations of the satellites. The fact is that in this 2026 context, finally, at the beginning of last month, Boeing received a budget. Authorization from the United States Air Force to start developing prototypes, 2 prototypes of the E-7 Wedgetail for the United States Air Force. All right, so guys, in 2023, right, this decision by the United States to replace the Sentry with satellites resulted in them starting to retire half of their fleet of 31 Boeing E-3 Sentry aircraft in 2023. And today, in the current context, 15 of these planes have already been retired and are now in those aircraft graveyards out in the western United States, right? I don't know exactly which one the Sentry is in, but they're out there in the desert. And we know that these aircraft that stay in the desert can be put back into service at any time, right? Of course it will cost something, but these aircraft can be put back into service. The question is, at the beginning of 2026, the United States kept 6 Boeing E-3 Sentry in operation in the Middle East. 6, okay? Another 10 are in the United States at other bases. But as we know well, on March 29, the Iranians attacked and destroyed one of those Sentry aircraft, which means there are now 5 Boeing Sentry left. Let's go. And what does that mean? What does this Iranian attack really mean? Okay, I know it's shocking, all right? But what does it really mean? Let's start with the shocking part first. Really, it's the first time that an aircraft of such size and such importance, crucial to carrying out an entire war plan, an entire war operation, is hit. The only comparable case was back in the 60s in Vietnam, the destruction of some B-52s bomber planes. 4-engine, I believe even bigger than the Sentry, by Vietnamese anti-aircraft artillery, North Vietnamese, and also North Vietnamese fighter jets. But after that, the losses of American aircraft were concentrated in smaller planes, okay? This is the first large aircraft really lost to enemy action since that time. So it's a shock. It's definitely a shock. And even more so because it wasn't a super sophisticated system, most likely a drone, right? Because if we look at all these daily Iranian reports of ballistic missile and drone launches, we can see that the ballistic missile launches have been greatly reduced. And Iran has been maintaining a pretty large number of ballistic drones, right? Daily then? Also a shock, because for the first time, a large and important plane like that was hit directly by a low-cost weapon. A weapon that's simple to build, relatively simple, made with cheap components, right? It got past the anti-missile and anti-drone defenses and hit a highly important, very important target, right? Is that it? So this will lead to a rearrangement of the American defensive system, of American defensive thinking. Because even though their anti-drone defenses have a high interception rate, around 90%, 10% still get through. And what do these 10% accomplish? In this case, I believe the Iranians must have sent many, many drones to the same target, hoping that one of them would get through, which is what happened. One of them did. But the destruction of that plane, really means a definitive crippling loss in the American ability to wage war. No, because they have another 5 of those planes at the site, another 10 of those planes in the United States, and another 15 of those planes in storage out in the desert, and more, right? The United States can also, in an emergency, order the Successors, the Wedgetail, and in the end, use other platforms, right? Like the Navy's Hawkeye and, well, other aircraft, to provide early warning and control. I don't think it will come to that now. Tell me, did you already know about early warning aircraft? If you didn't know and just found out now, let us know in the comments. I'd really like to know your opinion. If you liked this video, then share it with your friends, and also give us a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe to War Room so you don't miss anything. I'll stop here for now. Thank you again for watching, and here's a big hug from War Room.